artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello and welcome to episode 233. We're going big today. We have an astrophysicist on the show. J. Craig Wheeler is the Samuel T. and Fern Yanagisawa Regents Professor of Astronomy Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of the new book, The Path to Singularity: How Technology Will Challenge the Future of Humanity, released on November 19th. He's a Fellow of the American Physical Society and Legacy Fellow of the American Astronomical Society, has published nearly 400 scientific papers, authored both professional and popular books on supernovae, and served on advisory committees for NSF, NASA, and the National Research Council. His new book, spanning the range of technologies that are propelling us towards singularity from robots to space colonization, has a foreword by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says, quote, "The world is long overdue for a peek at the state of society and what its future looks like through the lens of a scientist. And when that scientist is also an astrophysicist, you can guarantee the perspective shared will be as deep and as vast as the universe itself." End quote. We're going to talk about the evolution of Homo sapiens, high-reliability organizations, brain-computer interfaces, and transhumanism, among other topics. So let's get into the interview. Well, Craig Wheeler, welcome to Artificial Intelligence and You. You have a new book coming out, The Path to Singularity: How Technology Will Challenge the Future of Humanity. Big themes, and astrophysicists are used to thinking about big themes, and you've got a foreword by Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is quite the feather in your cap here, acknowledging that you're thinking about these big things. So let me ask you what your background has been here, your career path that took you through astrophysics, and what is now prompting you to go beyond that to look at the bigger issues of where the human race is going on this planet?
Yeah, well, it came out of my academic environment. I taught a course. Little background on that. We have a program at the University of Texas at Austin where professors can suggest a reading, and incoming freshman students can choose that book, and then you get together and talk about them before classes start. It's just a thing to get people integrated in the large university that we have. So mostly I did astrophysics, works on supernovae and neutron stars and black holes and things like that. But I also got involved in astrobiology, which brings directly in questions of origin of life, and is there life out there, and can we find it, and all those kind of topics, and had a very interesting time doing that. So that was kind of planted in my head. And at one point, I read a statement, I don't remember where it was now, by a preacher who said, "I believe in evolution, ancestors and through human beings and developing Homo sapiens and all of that. But," this learned man said, "I am convinced that Homo sapiens is the peak, that this is it." And I thought to myself, I hadn't thought about this deeply before, but whenever I first learned about evolution back in school, I just assumed that we were an evolving species and not static. There's no reason to think that. And so I used that anecdote to suggest to some incoming students that we just read Darwin. And so we did that, and it was interesting and had an interesting discussion. And I kind of raised this point of what the preacher had said, and how do you think are we evolving or static? And there were a lot of students in the class. There's like a dozen people. It's a small group, but there was a significant number of them that realized that with our understanding of DNA and mapping the human genome, and CRISPR wasn't quite part of the news yet, but it was there, that we were on the verge of being able to control our own evolution. And I just hadn't thought that thought before at all. But coming off that, I thought collectively all of this, the astrophysics and the origin of life and this kind of question might make a good course. So I started teaching a course on it in 2013, taught it for 5 years, had a great time with it. It was just intellectually fascinating to explore all these things, and got into things like artificial intelligence and robots and all sorts of things that are, in my mind, at least all loosely connected. And then out of that, well, maybe I could make a book out of this. And then drew on all this experience and more and things the students had said in class. And I did a lot of reading over that 5 years and integrated all that into it. So I don't have any particular detailed expertise in these things, but I've been thinking about them for a long time and realized as I was writing the book, I'd been thinking about it much longer than I quite realized. And Neil Tyson's foreword, I really appreciate because he caught that spirit. Why is an astronomer entitled to write about these topics? And the answer basically is just a concerned citizen who thinks about these things and try to put it in my own words and my own concerns and thoughts about it. So that's my license to do so, just that I've thought about it quite a bit and tried to express it coherently.
Well, he reminded me of a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who said, there are only two possibilities. Either we are totally alone in the universe or we are not. And they're both mind-boggling.
Yes.
And so you suggest to me that there are also only two possibilities in evolution, which are either we have reached the terminal state and will not evolve any further, or we have not. And both of those possibilities are also mind-boggling.
I think so. And so I have my own opinion on that. I just find it very hard to believe that we will be static. Human beings didn't walk the planet 500,000 years ago. Homo sapiens didn't exist. And so we have evolved out of that, and I just can't see it flattening out. And so there's two ways of not surviving. Either we can evolve into something else naturally, a Darwinian sort of natural selection. We can now tinker with our own genes, which we are doing with things like CRISPR, and we're learning to engineer all that. Or we can blow ourselves up in some way. And so there are ways to not have humans, Homo sapiens, in the future. My bet is that we will tinker with our own evolution, that I think that's the technology is there and people are going to use it, and you can make guesses about where it might take us.
Well, I suppose that for the sake of completeness, if nothing else, if we are capable of taking control of our own evolution, that would imply that we're capable of stopping our evolution. Do you think that could happen?
I suppose it's possible, and I would guess that there are people who would like to do that. My own sense is that these forces are kind of inevitable and that people will further the technology just because it's a sweet thing to do, and that force is the more overwhelming one, I think. So yes, there could be some resistance, but I think change, let's not call it progress, I don't know, change is inevitable, in my opinion.
Well, and of course, the other danger is that if we stop evolving, then something else that is evolving might overtake us. And there's no shortage of speculation.
Like AI, for instance.
Exactly.
Which is more the topic of our discussion in principle.
Yeah, it is. Do you still have a teaching load?
I don't. I retired 5 years ago, just before COVID. I spent a lot of my post-COVID time. I'm still working in astrophysics just because it's fun to do, but spent my post-COVID time writing this book and other things, other books.
What do you think it would be like having a teaching load right now in an age of generative AI, and how would you face that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been relieved I didn't have to face that. My colleagues who were still teaching during COVID have to all of a sudden switch from a stand-up lecture they were used to doing into online things. It was pretty traumatic, and I was happy I didn't have to do that. Some universities, including mine, University of Texas, are actively putting together programs to integrate generative AI in their teaching. And that is going to come to us at some level. It's a great question, Peter, but I haven't thought very deeply about how I would cope with that particular thing. One would. I mean, you adapt to technologies, PowerPoint and such things. I learned how to use that with somewhat properly. And I guess I would figure out how to use generative AI. But I must say, I don't use it a lot now. I'm happy to be a writer writing things out of my own head. And I haven't gotten in any context deeply into using AI. I've used an AI editor on the book. I've used it to check plagiarism, which I tried very hard not to do. But you read a million things and they're all there in your head or in your notes somewhere. But I haven't been an active adopter of ChatGPT, for instance, which came out just as the book was finishing. So I had to scramble and go back and write a few things about ChatGPT. And of course, it's caught the attention of the world by now.
There are a few topics you get into in your book that I'd like to dig into in some detail.
Sure.
You mentioned high reliability organizations, and that caught my eye. And I wonder if you could describe those to us and what their relevance is to the subject.
Yeah, it turns out there is a discipline of trying to make a sort of, as much as possible, failure-free operation. An example I give is nuclear submarines. I think there's been very few nuclear accidents, certainly in the U.S. fleet, and I don't think anybody killed by a nuclear reactor, because the Navy learned how to handle nuclear reactors and submarines and worked at it very carefully. And there's all sorts of prescriptions about it. You have to have information flowing both up and down, although clearly in the Navy there's a command structure from the admirals on down. But for a reliable organization, you have to have people who are on the ground doing the work be able to feed up into the upper administration. You have to have a psychology that if there hasn't been a mistake or an error made, it's sitting there lurking and ready to go. And you have to be ready to face that. You can't say, well, things are going along swimmingly, so I can relax. You have to have a very active mindset for it. So there is kind of a prescription of things. I'm not sure I'm remembering all of them right now, but given that we're worried about making trustworthy, ethical AI and all those kinds of things and trying to keep it under control. When I ran across this literature, I was very interested in it and set it aside. I said, well, you got to work that into the book when you get to it. I think it's a really important thing. There are related issues of quality control where you try to keep errors to a minimum. And I think they're almost two words for the same thing. But in the Apollo disaster, where the astronauts were killed on the base when the fire broke out, my father was working for General Electric at the time, and General Electric was given the quality control enterprise at Apollo, and my dad moved down to Houston and finished his career working on Apollo doing quality control, which is basically the same thing as making a reliable organization. And you can't do everything, but you can still have this psychology that tries to put you in the mode of being aware, be constantly sensitive, communication lines flowing, make sure we miss as little as possible. You can't do it perfectly, but...
So that's a very good point about the reliability of organizations, because there are quite a few differences. We look at, for instance, civil aviation safety. It's remarkably safe because of the interaction between the FAA and the NTSB and aircraft manufacturers. Every accident is investigated with an engineering rigor that traces it back to a root cause, and then there is a fix issued. And that's exactly the way it should work. And you referenced the Apollo 1 accident, and now that's a bit more interesting because that was investigated with engineering rigor as well and traced to using a pure oxygen atmosphere. But that wasn't the root cause. The root cause was not an engineering failure, but a psychological failure, because the same thing happened in the Challenger and Columbia incidents, which again had different engineering causes, but all three of these incidents had the same root cause, which was management not listening to engineers on issues of safety, because those engineers said before each one of those incidents, this is going to happen, and were ignored or suppressed. So this is one of my favorite, unfortunately, topics. And then we look at, for instance, deaths due to avoidable medical mistakes are the third leading cause of death in the United States. And that is something where there is no process close to what the NTSB does for investigating those, not even remotely close, or there would be a lot fewer of those. And yet those lives are worth just as much as the people in an airplane. So it comes down a lot to psychology, and to the link back to artificial intelligence then is, are we managing this with the organizations that will have the reliability that we need to avoid a crash or a death on the operating table or the equivalent with artificial intelligence? And what does your research suggest in that respect?
Well, I think one of the things that is suggested, not my idea, is you get AI involved in it, drawing on everything it can, like a large language model or something. You want humans to monitor what the AI is saying, and you want the AI to monitor what the humans are saying, and get that closed loop in there. That's part of the reliability, is you check and cross-check. And indeed, your example of the medical situation is a very stark one, isn't it? It's clear that you've thought, I mean, I'm aware of it, but you've clearly thought about it more deeply than I have. But yeah, that's exactly what you would do to make that a transportation board type issue. But I think in general, we need to do things like that with AI, not in those particular examples, but more generally, to try to monitor AI and what it's doing and have it monitor us at the same time, so that we don't have sort of a runaway artificial general intelligence that takes control in a Schwarzenegger doomsday sort of thing, but try to keep it all under control. And that's going to be tricky to do. That's a hard problem. And the first thing you do is enunciate the problem, and I'm not certainly the first person to do that, but have talked about that a bit.
I find it fascinating how astrophysicists get into these broad areas, you and Tyson. And it occurs to me that your profession thinks about the very biggest things in the universe and the very smallest things. You're all the way up to the biggest structures in the universe, galactic webs and the origin of the Big Bang, and the very tiniest things, the quarks and neutrinos and other subatomic particles and how they're related. And you have to get at all of those. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that everything in between is fair game as well. And that also touches on something else that you mention in the book, the quantum possibility, or the possibility that the human brain is quantum in nature. Where do you stand on that?
Oh boy, I don't know. That comes from people thinking about that. And fundamentally, the universe works on quantum principles. I think we're sure about that. The question of whether the brain itself does, I think the story is out on that. There's some reason to be skeptical about it, just because there's so much heat and it's so loose and it's rattling around in there that the quantum effects are kind of averaged out in some way. So I don't know. I mean, the whole issue of consciousness, how our consciousness works, whether machines could be conscious, is a huge issue, of course. I'm kind of waffling on your question. I don't know the answer. I think maybe it's not quantum, but I'm definitely not an expert in that.
And where it becomes really important is we're now constructing brain-computer interfaces. And
absolutely. Now, that's a big topic and one I have thought about.
And if the way that we think is quantum in nature, that would radically alter the proposition of constructing brain-computer interfaces. But so far, we've been able to do some things with that, and they're useful, very useful to people who are, for instance, quadriplegic. Mm-hmm. So where do you see that going? What principles are driving brain-computer interface design, and what do you think lies down the road?
Right. So let me answer that, but then I'd love to come back to your point about if the brain is quantum, it will affect that, because I hadn't thought about that. Maybe you could elaborate on that. So what's going on now is that there are a lot of work going on trying to read signals from the brain. That there are various ways externally or planting things in your brain where you can measure the activity of neurons, and you can locate what a certain set of neurons are doing in some place that controls something else, how they respond to input and how they respond to output. And so it is certainly true that there is a growing technology of being able to read brain signals. It's modestly well established, and I think that field is going to advance exponentially. I mean, a lot of people working on it. And the key there is AI, because you have to be able to take all these signals that they're not random, but they're complicated. And AI is the intermediary that allows people to say, okay, that bunch of neuron flashes means this. And so you can then start reading externally what somebody is thinking, or play them a video and monitor the neural response and deduce what video it is that they're watching. It's still rudimentary, but it's very impressive. So basically, it's AI catalyzed or enabled mind reading. And again, it's rudimentary, but it's roaring ahead. And then you can control prosthetics, as you were saying, for quadriplegics, but it doesn't have to be quadriplegics. You could think with your brain and control a robot arm, on the moon in principle. I think there's all sorts of applications that are starting in that medical thing and trying to help individual people. But the horizons of where that could go are just vast, I think. And then the other side is more complicated, but there are some steps moving in that direction. Work at MIT that I've read about, of implanting signals. So once you kind of know what it's doing, again, it's AI enabled in some way, that you can input a signal into the brain and trigger thoughts of various kinds. And if you can get that going both ways, then you have mental telepathy, something that we've dreamed about, fantasized about for a very long time as people have puzzled about how the brain works. But you now have at least the starting potential of a two-way thing, where you could have, with AI in the middle, you could have brain-to-brain communication. And that opens up to just vast horizons to my mind. That when I first started thinking those thoughts, I thought, well, I'm thinking these new thoughts. And I realized, no, there are people who have already thought about this. But I think it's a very under-discussed potential of what AI can do. And my tagline on that, Peter, just to finish that thought, is some people say this would be great if we could just think at one another. And my reaction is more conservative, I guess, in that regard. I'm delighted to have a conversation with you, but I don't really want to know what you're thinking, and I don't really want you to know what I'm thinking. Let's put it into words. And if we could do that, it would just completely change human interactions. If we really could read one another's minds. And how do you control that? How do you share what you want to communicate or not? I just don't know how that would work in practice. So I think it's a really huge issue that is not discussed enough.
And the guardrails and safety that there needs to be around that are on a level that we have never thought about before. But
that is true.
AI has given us this 500-year jump on where we thought, or what we thought it would take to do this, because the structure of higher order thoughts, like thinking about, I'd like a burrito or a concerto, was something we had no clue how those were encoded in the brain, and thought that it would take a century of neuroscience to figure that out. But we don't have to, because, as you say, AI can figure out patterns. And so with training, even though we may never understand how it did it, it can do that. And then it can go the other way, as you say. So we could have this communication where I can hear what you're thinking and you could hear what I'm thinking. It might not be on the same level of empathy where you could experience what it's like to be me, which would be phenomenally useful for medical diagnosis and other things, or necessarily have an accurate representation of my emotional states or an ambiguous interpretation of my language. But it could at least be, I think a sentence and you hear it, and vice versa. And so that's an era that we are on the verge of. The children in school right now are going to deal with governance around things like that in their careers. And you've got experience in preparing students to enter the world and deal with what they find there. So what do we need in the way of the governance structures, and what's missing that we can do something about to help ensure that this works out safely?
Yeah, so this is a little simplistic of me, but I think where you have to start is defining the issue. And so that is what I've aspired to do in this book, is to raise this issue. Now, how you actually start putting regulations and structure into place. Complicated issue, and I don't have any well-defined answers to that, but I think you have to have large cross-sections of society participating in these discussions. You can't just have the federal government come along and impose something. You can't have big companies deciding how they're going to do this, which I think they probably are. They're working on things like this, and they probably have their scheme of how they want to implement that. And it's not just the computer scientists and the engineers. It's got to be ordinary people who are going to be subject to these technologies, mind reading or other things that need to be at the table when you're trying to figure out how to implement healthy AI. I think you can't, it's like we discussed before, this is a topic where I don't think you can stop it, the biological enterprises and affecting evolution. And I don't think we could stop AI at this point. There's just too many independent forces, individual scientists in their labs, whole companies, whole countries pushing this forward. I don't think it's stoppable. So again, we have to control it. You're asking me, how do we do that? And I am encouraged by, and when I started writing the book, there wasn't much discussion of this. By now, there's a lot of discussion of forming ethical AI and how do we keep it under control. I don't think it's come to an ending by any means at all, but the conversation is going on, and it wasn't when I started writing the book. So I'm heartened by that. The U.S. had an election last night. And just in terms of the topic we're talking about, I don't think either candidate for president discussed these kinds of issues of there's technology marching ahead that is going to be a challenge to society. What do we do about it? I don't think either candidate talked about that. But coming out of the Biden administration has taken some steps to put in regulations and how to cooperate with people. And Biden just released a couple of weeks ago a new executive order relating to this. And so I presumed that Harris would keep going with that. On the other hand, I tried to pay some attention. I may have missed something, but I don't think I've ever heard Trump say anything about these issues. And so the question of, how are we going to go going forward, they bifurcate with this election, where it might have gone with Harris. And I think President-to-be Trump will have to deal with it. I think this is an inevitable thing happening in society, and he's going to be faced with doing it. And even over the next 4 years, things are going to happen.
Well, we don't know. I suspect he will defer to Elon Musk on these kind of matters.
I wasn't going to get into too many specifics, but yes, among other things, yeah.
Well, let's pull this back into some more science before we bring it to a close. We've been talking about broad swathes of science here that's all linked. And your book gets into everything from evolution to cryptocurrency. And we've talked some about, well, what is it that unites all of this? And I'd just like you to put your spin on, well, what's the common thread here that pulls together all of these very different topics that you've got in your book?
Well, it is AI at some level. So when I'm talking about the evolution of humans, it's not explicitly about AI, but we've already threaded AI through so much of this. The brain weeding, the AI has now taught us how to understand protein folding, which is just critical to biological issues. I don't know whether it's AI specifically, but the fact that private companies, and clearly SpaceX is a leader in this under Elon Musk, can launch a rocket and then bring the booster back and land it on a base or on a floating thing or something. That's a technology that NASA didn't invent. It was private companies invented that, and it's very successful, and it's going to make space travel cheaper and get us to Mars sooner, I think, if you play that over some time. So AI is threaded through a lot of this, not necessarily everything. I talk about climate change as well, but I suspect AI, just understanding vast amounts of data and sorting through patterns and whatnot, which is what it does, will help with that problem too, but I don't know specifically what it might be. So AI is kind of the theme through this. I guess that there's a couple of broader themes. One, when I start off talking about, as I did in the class, just the difference between change that kind of happens steadily, that the same amount all the time, or change that happens exponentially. And the latter occurs when the more you know, the more you can accomplish. So things build on themselves. And I think that's why technology in general is growing exponentially. Not every aspect at the same rate, but it's growing exponentially. And most people struggle to try to understand what life will be like when this exponentially growing technology wave, we're in the middle of it growing here, but when that hits us. And the critical aspect of that, to my mind, is that we've clearly had change before, the Industrial Revolution, the automobile, all that kind of stuff. And it was traumatic to some people. If you were a horse and buggy manufacturer, the arrival of the automobile was a traumatic thing. But we've more or less survived those things. But it was because the change was happening slowly enough that some individuals and society could adjust to it. But now we're seeing this exponentially ever faster technology. And my concern in general, and this is threaded through the book, is that these changes will start happening faster than individuals, or maybe more importantly, our society, can even adjust to them. And that's a qualitatively different aspect of human existence. Not just that there's always been change, but there's going to be change so fast that it's overwhelming, I think.
Because there are physical limits to like how fast we can think and build things and react. And we can use AI to help with some of those things. But there will still come a point where our biology is the bottleneck. And I think for the things that you're talking about in this book and what we've mentioned in terms of human biology, human evolution, there is a label for these concepts of self-directed evolutionary change, which is transhumanism. Would you put yourself in the transhumanism camp?
Well, maybe I kind of put myself into that without calling it that. I guess I thought about it, again, I haven't invented it, in the context that we may merge with our machines in some way. As the machines get smarter and faster and brighter than we are, out of self-defense, we may have to, plant something in our heads or something that allow us to talk to other humans, but talk to machines. I don't know quite how that would work. So I guess my thoughts on that are, yes, things like this are apt to come, and we need to think about it and get ahead of them if we can. Whether I would turn that into formally calling myself a transhumanist, I guess I would resist that a little bit. That feels, to give it that label is putting it in a box that I'm not sure will be adequate to the situation.
And there are other people who have put themselves in that box that hold views that might not comport with yours or mine for that matter. So it is perhaps a little unfair. But since you brought up this matter of the evolutionary change of the human race, then we do need some kind of ethical guardrails around that don't exist at the moment because it's essentially happening by accident. Of course, that's how natural evolution happens, Indeed. But that doesn't necessarily lead in the direction that we want. So if we want to control that, we need something that would probably warm the hearts of many transhumanists that puts that on some kind of formal basis. Who would you like to see doing that?
Who would I like to see doing that?
It doesn't have to be necessarily individuals, but if you were tasked with making that happen, where would you draw the talent from?
So this may sound like a waffly answer, but again, as in other technological things, I think you need a very broad set of input. The technologists, the experts, people on the street with practical experience and just trying to live their lives. Thank you very much. I think it's got to be a society-wide conversation. I can't think of any one community that I would say, let's assign this to them. I admire experts. I'm an expert in astronomy. I admire experts. I think they're absolutely necessary. If you denigrate experts, I think you're being dumb. But to pick out a particular set of experts and say, these are the ones that ought to be in charge of designing human evolution in the future, I think it's too big a problem for that. It's a society.
Well, not necessarily in charge of it, but the ones that would have some input into it. Now, you have a great deal of experience in higher education and research universities. So I wonder what you would think about work like that being located in a university. I mean, there are the questions of the funding, but assuming those things came together to make it possible, do you think that would be the best place for that to happen?
Well, best is a big word, but I would certainly say, so yes, this is part of my experience, that universities, with research in universities and teaching students in those universities about these topics is a very important aspect of it. I wouldn't say it's the only one. I'm a little prejudiced. Maybe it's the best one. I'm a little nervous about leaving it. I'm not an anti-capitalist by any means at all. I great admire capitalism, but I don't know that I want to leave these kinds of issues to large profit-seeking corporations either. Only. I think they should be part of the conversation, absolutely. And our current structure, that they would have to be, as they are, the Microsofts and the OpenAIs and the Alphabets and the Metas of the world. That's just part of our truth. They're going hell-bent for leather after all this technology. So,
well, let's hope that some kind of convergence of appropriate funding source and the talent at some universities to form a center for studying this and making the kind of ethical recommendations and research that we're going to need can come about. And with that, we'll wrap this up. So what would you like to tell people about the book as a enticement to go get it? And then we'll have a link to it in the show notes and transcript, but you can also tell them where to find it verbally. So
I appreciate that. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this book is just to raise attention to these topics. And so I hope this conversation has helped to further that. The book will be released on November 19th. It will be in bookstores everywhere, large online order things, your local bookstores, which I'm a great fan of. I hope a lot of people buy the book, but I hope they buy it in their local bookstores as well. I think thinking intelligent individuals should read this book. And I've got a bunch of people saying they agree with me on that, just to get the issues out there and jumpstart people thinking about them. Because, in our daily lives, you can go around without really worrying very much about whether AI is going to lead to mental telepathy or not. But we need to spread those words and get people thinking about them and take a broad approach to trying to keep it under control, because it's unstoppable. I think it's unstoppable.
Absolutely agree. And thank you for helping raise awareness in that way with your book, The Path to Singularity, How Technology Will Challenge the Future of Humanity, and with a very complimentary foreword by Neil deGrasse Tyson, coming out, as you say, very soon. So, Craig Wheeler, thank you very much for coming on Artificial Intelligence and You.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much for the invitation.
That's the end of the interview. As you can tell, we recorded this the morning after the 2024 US elections. Still don't know what those results are going to mean for AI. I think the point we touched on of high reliability organizations is one that could use a lot more attention. Thinking as I did there about the difference in avoidable mortality rates between civil aviation and medicine, and their respective approaches and humility towards diagnosing and fixing systemic errors makes it clear that culture makes a big difference in how reliable a system is. So, what's the culture around how AI systems are made and used? How can we change that? In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, Amazon is beta testing AI-generated audiobooks. They own Audible, the audiobook platform, where you can incidentally find the audio version of Artificial Intelligence and You, my 2022 book, narrated by yours truly, who might have saved a lot of time with what Amazon is doing now, because they've started working with a group of narrators to train AI clones and thereby speed up the rate of audiobook production. Amazon said, quote, "There is a vast catalog of books that does not yet exist in audio, and as we explore ways to bring more books to life on Audible, we're committed to thoughtfully balancing the interests of authors, narrators, publishers, and listeners." End quote. They have not previously allowed AI narration on Audible. Obviously, most of the story here is around the terms of licensing, copyright, and compensation, which may change in the future since this is a pilot. But it says that the technology has reached the stage where AI quality is good enough for audiobooks. I can tell you from personal experience that the parameters on the audio that Audible requires are quite exacting and take some professional work to get right. But none of those relate to the emotional quality or human realism of the recordings, so since it will be fairly easy for AI to meet the requirements for parameters like noise floor and dynamic range, will we get a flood of audiobooks of perfect audio fidelity but questionable human fidelity? We will have to wait and see. Next week, my guest will be Dwayne Wood, Associate Professor at National University, who teaches educators how to teach in today's AI world. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.